Welcome to Melbourne Town Hall and this Melbourne Conversation, Jobs in the Knowledge Economy, Threat or Opportunity, brought to you by the City of Melbourne as part of Melbourne Knowledge Week 2015. My name's Peter Mares, I'm contributing editor with the online magazine Inside Story, and I'm looking forward to a lively and engaging discussion with our four panellists, Bernard Salt, Janine Dixon, Marcus Westbury and Sherri Bruinhout. I'll introduce them to you shortly. It's become commonplace to say that we live in a digital era and now too in an age of disruption. We're connected like never before, and our very connectivity gives rise to new ways of doing things and unanticipated business models. It's possible for almost anyone to turn their home into a bed and breakfast through Airbnb, or to turn their car into a taxi via Uber. Lots of the things we used to buy at the shop, we now order online, and products that once came to us in boxes are now delivered as megabytes of data across wires or through the ether. Then there are changes wrought by technology and automation that both destroy and create jobs. Supermarket checkout assistants may soon be an anachronism, as much of an anachronism as tram conductors perhaps. I guess there are jobs in polishing and servicing the machines, not to mention the supermarket's equivalents of ticket inspectors, the extra security guards to make sure you don't whip past the scanner without paying for your goods. So, is the future one of promise or one of threat or a mix of both? Will we secure our future prosperity by being nimble knowledge workers, and if so, what capabilities will we need to thrive? What happens to those who, for whatever reason, fall through the digital cracks? Our first speaker this evening is going to lay out the big picture, the territory for us, and then I'll engage him and our other three contributors and you in a discussion of the issues. Bernard Salt is a leading commentator and advisor to Corporate Australia on consumer, cultural and demographic trends. He's a Melbourne-based partner with the global advisory firm KPMG. He writes 2 weekly columns for The Australian and is an adjunct professor at Curtin University Business School. And Bernard's written at least 5 big-selling books and made countless research reports on issues of change, demography, trends and so on, including a recent report called Super Connected Jobs, very much understanding our future workforce, very much on topic tonight. Please welcome Bernard Salt to tell us about the threats and opportunities of jobs in the knowledge economy.
Thanks very much, Peter, for that introduction. Thank you also to the Melbourne City Council for the invitation to speak. Bernard Salt, partner with KPMG Melbourne. I have a couple of slides, and if we could get the slides up. A couple of slides which will hopefully illustrate the issues around jobs of the future. And this is at an Australian level. This is a big picture view of the Australian workforce. So there's 11 million people working on the Australian continent. And this chart shows net growth in the workforce in the 21st century from August 2000 to August 2015. As a fact, here is how the workforce has changed. We have added, in fact, if you go back, we have added 3.1 million jobs over the last 15 years. We have lost 343,000 jobs over the last 15 years, and those jobs might be in a car assembly plant, for example. We've created 3.1 million, we've lost 340,000. For every job that we have lost, we have created 10 jobs. It's a 10-to-1 ratio, in fact. So we are creating jobs. There are new jobs being created, even at a time when car manufacturing plants are closing in maybe Broadmeadows or in Geelong or in Elizabeth in South Australia. And we've created a net growth of 2.8 million jobs over that time frame. Where are the jobs being created? Where are the 10 jobs that are being created for every job that's being lost? In fact, if you go to the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that almost 700,000 jobs have been created in healthcare and social assistance. Another 400,000 in professional services, construction and education. Never look at the numbers in demographics, the numbers are boring. It's a theme that is driving through these figures that explain what is actually happening. Go to the other end of the chart and see the sort of jobs that are contracting, and jobs that are contracting in manufacturing. We've lost 200,000 jobs in manufacturing alone over the last 15 years, and maybe another 100,000 jobs in agriculture. What is the common denominator between the left-hand side of the chart and the right-hand side of the chart? And I say that the common denominator is skills. In order to participate in the prosperity of modern Australia, 21st century Australia, you need either a university degree or some form of technical training. Of course, this is the knowledge economy. For 200 years in Australia, you could be a 15-year-old, barely literate and barely numerate, but you could participate in the prosperity of Australia if you worked on a factory, in a farm, in a shop, in a warehouse, or as a waiter. Where does unskilled, low-skilled, barely skilled people in Australia get a job in the back half of this decade if we are shifting at a rate of knots towards a knowledge economy? So, well, they don't get a job. This increases social welfare, social disconnection, disaffection. You have a large section of the community that feel disenfranchised. I do not belong here. I cannot get access to or share within the prosperity of the Australian nation and continent. I actually see this as quite a dark perspective of the future. I think there is a great challenge if that is in fact the future. That is the threat of the future. So we need risk mitigation programs now. We need ways to engage everyone in the community. We need to think about wealth distribution issues, about who actually has prosperity, who has the wealth, and how that's in fact shared. I see this as a great issue. It's a great social issue going forward. The jobs that will be created, of course, up here in the left-hand side of the chart, and you think, well, these are knowledge worker jobs. If you look at that in a Melbourne context, where are the knowledge worker jobs? Well, that'd be in the CBD, or in health precincts, or in university precincts. Well, that'd be in the inner city, wouldn't it? The apartmentification of Melbourne, knowledge workers, Generation Y, gravitating to the inner suburbs, up to maybe a 10 or a 15k radius of the CBD. You can actually see a complete narrative emerging. And the sort of jobs, if you look at the jobs that have expanded most rapidly over the last two censuses, certainly technical jobs, geeky jobs, like electrical engineer and computer engineer, absolutely rocketing ahead. The automation, robotification, artificial intelligence, all of those STEM skills that we require, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The best thing you can do for your kids, I think, in terms of future-proofing their career, is to give them access to those technical skills. Not everyone, of course, wants to be part of that techno set, if you like. I think there are jobs in caring in the future, old people and kids. Social work, perhaps. There are jobs around caring. There'll be jobs around doing plumbers, electricians, carpenters. Melbourne is 4.5 million people today. By the middle of the century, it'll be 7.5 million people. We will need to be able to deliver housing in the future. The sort of tools that plumbers, electricians, carpenters use may be different, but we need practical people. And then finally, I think we will need or create a category called creative type jobs. A more positive view of the future is that we are going to release humanity from the boring drudgery of repetitive work. The dark view is that this creates a disaffected, sullen group that is disconnected from society. Or does that trigger a release and release the more creative elements of society, and people create jobs in wellness, well-being, the creative arts, for example? We might find people in the Dandenongs writing symphonies, perhaps, because they can do it. Not everyone in the future will be pursuing the maximum possible income they can. They'll be pursuing jobs because they want to do them in the future. This is the positive view of the future. It's not just about the knowledge economy, it's not just the jobs of the future. I want to put a chart up at the moment, which I find quite confronting. Here are the top 10 companies in America today on the left-hand side. And Apple, of course, is the biggest company on earth by market capitalisation, $626 billion in market capital. It's half the Australian GDP. And if you look through Apple, Google, Microsoft, so forth, Facebook, Amazon's down the bottom, and the year in which they were formed, let's compare that with Australia. We're 1/10 of the size, But here is the Australian figure. There is something that screams out to me from this chart, and it's not the market capitalisation. We're small. It is the year in which these businesses were created. America is innovative. It is agile. It is mobile. It is entrepreneurial. It rewards enterprise. That energy delivers in spades. 5 of the top 10 businesses created in a generation, 2 in the last 10 years. The most recent big business created on the Australian continent was formed in 1924. If we are to be a knowledge economy, a smart economy, we need to be an innovative economy. We need to embrace enterprise and entrepreneurship. We need to lose the tall poppy thing. We need to celebrate entrepreneurialism, the skill of taking nothing and creating jobs, employing people, paying tax, doing the right thing. Smart jobs and entrepreneurship is really, I think, the way to go. If we actually look at what I think we need to focus on education, continual learning into the future. The other point I would say is upskilling, reskilling, perhaps even relocating and building social cohesion, and particularly over the next 10 or 15 years as we draw in those unskilled workers or workers in transition. In fact, next one. We need to develop soft skills from an early age. There are studies that have said that Generation Y might have 10, perhaps even 15 jobs during a 40-year career. Now, how could you future-proof yourself against that? Maybe, if you don't have the right technical skills or whatever, I think you can future-proof your career by developing soft skills. And you don't learn this at university. It means that 10 or 15 times in your career, you need to walk into an office or a situation and pitch your case. Here is what I can do, here is how I can fit in. You need to actually sell, you need to be social, affable, fluid, agile, flexible. You need to be unthreatened by actually pitching yourself as to how you can fit in to a modern and changing workforce. And I think that social affability, that easygoingness, if you like, is actually taught in the home environment. It's not necessarily taught at university. In fact, if you look at the best skill sets, it'd be people, geeks, that have good social skills, lovable, affable geeks, probably, with an entrepreneurial flair, probably the ones that are going to be in the future. And create a culture of enterprise. If we celebrate a culture of enterprise and having a go, we must also have a concurrent culture of celebrating failure, because success comes with failure. You didn't get it this time, but you'll get it next time. I think that this goes hand in hand. If we're going to reshape the Australian economy, the Melbourne economy, towards a knowledge economy going forward, then we need to build a concurrent culture around celebrating success and failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernard, and affable geeks. There might be a contradiction in terms there, I'm not sure, but thank you for showing us that the future is both a promise and a threat, and perhaps very much in our hands what we make it, what we turn it into. I'd like to invite our other 3 speakers to join Bernard in the comfy chairs here up on stage, and I'll introduce them to you as they come up. Dr. Janine Dixon is a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies at Victoria University, an economic modeller and forecaster, and previously worked at the Australian Bureau of Statistics managing various surveys of Australian service industries. Marcus Westbury is a broadcaster, writer, media maker, festival director, and you might have seen his recent ABC TV series Bespoke, featuring lots of hipster beards, among other things. He's just also crowdsourced this excellent book, Creating Cities, which tells of his attempts to open a small bar in Newcastle and how that ended up turning into a project to transform the decaying centre of an industrial city in the path-breaking initiative that is known as Renew Newcastle. And Sherri Bruinhout is Director of Homelessness and Justice at Melbourne City Mission. So she's responsible for crisis accommodation, homelessness support services, justice, youth and family connection programs, and previously led the Front Yard Youth Services team, offering joined-up solutions to young people experiencing homelessness. Please make them welcome. You can see how non-digital age I am because I have an analogue clock, so I can keep us all on time. So, Janine, let's start with you. What's your response to what we've heard from Bernard? Because you also look at the shape of the economy and the future trends and so on.
Yeah, well, absolutely, I agree with what Bernard showed, and the big chart that he had up for a long time. I wonder if we could have that again. Maybe that's too difficult. Anyway, that's something that I've spent a lot of time looking at. And as an economist, I try and understand the reasons behind why we've had why the industries that are on the left-hand side of that chart are there, and why the industries on the right-hand side are where they are. And I think one of the big driving forces, particularly behind the decline of manufacturing employment, is the substitution of labour for two things. One is substitution of labour for automation, and the other is the substitution of local manufacturing for imported manufacturing. So we're a high wage economy, and it's difficult for commodities that are highly tradable to compete when transport costs are so low, when communication costs are so low. And so we have had a decline in manufacturing activity. A third factor behind that decline in manufacturing is pure saturation. Just as in the early part of the last century, the world economy was thrown into the greatest depression that was ever known, and a large part of that was due to technical change in the agricultural sector, releasing many workers from the agricultural sector, and the economy as it stood at the time wasn't ready to receive those workers into other industries. And in a sense there you had saturation in terms of food. The world had worked out how to produce enough food for itself. And it's almost as though...
So we're getting the same thing, but now we've got saturation of refrigerators.
We're saturated with refrigerators and...
cars and...
toys for my kids, goodness me. Anyway, so I think manufacturing has been a sector that's traditionally employed a lot of the low-skilled workers in our economy, and those workers are now very much moving towards the healthcare sector. So we have childcare, we have residential care. These are industries that are a lot safer from the very things that have led to the decline of manufacturing. They're not trade exposed. They're not at great danger.
Yeah, we can't really offshore our aged care.
That's right. They're not at great danger of automation.
Yeah.
You can offshore to an extent, but nothing like for manufacturing. You have ratios, staff to children in a childcare or staff to residents in aged care. So I think that healthcare and social services is going to be a great growth industry as we go forward for the more unskilled end of the population.
The problem there potentially, and we might discuss this further, is that manufacturing, at least in some sectors, was a fairly well-paid profession, and that's not necessarily the case with the service sector.
Yes, indeed, and there's a study that was done in America which showed that that if you ranked all the occupations by their wage, as it was in, the mid-70s, the manufacturing kind of sat in the middle. You had your low-end services at the bottom and your professionals at the top. And if you look at wage growth in those sectors over time, we actually find that the manufacturing growth has been the slowest, and it's the service sectors that have actually...
So there's a danger of a hollowing middle, if you like, of us having top-end, highly professionals, highly educated, and bottom-end service workers, and not so much in between?
Yeah. That's right. It's just it's a structural change in the economy.
Okay. Look, I'd like to come to Marcus now, and but before, Marcus is going to ask him. I'm going to ask Marcus whether he thinks the future might look a bit more like the past, and not just in terms of long beards, but whether before we do that, let's have a little. Watch of the brief trailer for his recent ABC TV series Bespoke, just to sort of fill us in, get the picture.
Sometimes when we put down our iPads, the 21st century feels a lot more like the 19th.
You can't turn around these days without running into an activist knitting collective.
cocktails in recycled jam jars, organic craft microbreweries, community veggie gardens, or a single origin coffee from a bearded barista in a fair trade cafe. Today, the crafty, the bespoke, the handmade, or at least the marketing and idea of it, are everywhere. What the hell is going on? Is all this nostalgia? Is it a reaction against technology or the product of it? Are we just reaching the end of the era of mass-produced plastic culture? Are our kids going to laugh at our ridiculous beards, our artisanal fetishes, the poorly knitted handmade beanies? Or are we actually changing the world that they're going to live in? I'm Marcus Westbury. Over the last few years, as I've been working with artists and communities across Australia, I've noticed an incredible rise and return of makers. In this series, I'll travel from blacksmiths and jewellers to leather crafts and 3D printing labs. From huts in Tasmania to corporate headquarters. From Newcastle to New York. So I can find out why we're all so suddenly obsessed with making the handmade, the authentic, and the artisanal. Is it a passing fad, a marketing gimmick, or is it part of a revolution that has the potential to transform the world?
Okay, Marcus, so now I'm going to ask you the very question you posed in the trailer, which is this just nostalgia? Is it a reaction against technology or product of it?
Okay, I had an hour and a half to answer that in the show, and I think I actually wimped out of actually attempting to answer it in the end. I think it's a bit of all of the above. I think the most fundamental change that I think is taking place is one in the technology of production and distribution. It's the idea that you can make things from anywhere to anywhere, that you can find a market and an audience if you're making something with a significant enough, whether it's a significantly unique product or a significantly unique story, or simply you can find a niche audience for what you do. So, I have spent a lot of time with people that are making things from regional communities to global markets, and they're able to find an audience for their work that would have been financially, the cost of finding that audience would have once been impossible. Yeah,
they could never rely on the foot traffic just coming past their door.
Being a jeweller in a small country, ABS data said that there's a 600 or 700% increase in jewellers in the last decade. And if you're a jeweller in Newcastle, which is where I've spent a lot of time, once upon a time you would have been dependent on who walked down the street to buy your stuff. Today, you've got access to a global marketplace through platforms like Etsy, through communities of interest. You can share skills, you can share knowledge, you can share whatever. And that is creating a new landscape where possibilities are opening up for people to do all sorts. It's not necessarily about the thing you do, but just the platform is there to do a wide variety of things.
And this is great, and it means we can drink much better beer, for example, and eat much better bread. But as you use the word yourself, niche. Yeah. So is this just kind of a comfortable retreat for the affluent middle class? Is it, that the farmers market the exception that proves the rules of the Coles-Woolly duopoly?
Potentially. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. I don't want to answer that. I mean, I think the future will play itself out in a variety of ways. I don't think it is specifically a middle class phenomenon. I actually think the niche, the idea of you take a farmers market and say, look, that is an example of something that appeals to a certain kind of affluent middle class niche. But then you can go and look at the way in which the world of hardcore music is being disrupted, or the way in which there's a whole range of niche cultural and sort of social production that it's about finding your audience, and your audience may not necessarily be middle class, they may not necessarily be rich, they may not necessarily be in the inner cities, and so you're getting these sort of peer-to-peer relationships formed between people that are doing all sorts of things. So yes, there's an element of that, and obviously, but that may be an element of early adoption more than an element of that's who it's purely about.
So we don't know where this trend will go.
No, I don't think so.
Especially with things, I guess, like 3D printing and stuff like that, 3D manufacturing that people can make things directly rather than, and bespoke.
Yeah, the tools are becoming democratised. Not just the tools of distribution, the tools of production are becoming democratised. We've already seen that in fields where what you produce is digital. So, if you're making music or film or video or whatever, those tools have become much more democratised. You no longer need to, hire a recording studio and engineer and get a vinyl press to make an album, But that same phenomenon is now starting to flow through to manufactured products, partially through 3D printing and things like that, and also through the exchange of knowledge and skills that go with, I want to make a thing, I'll Google how I make it, and I'm 3 steps from actually doing it.
Sherri Bruinhout, I imagine that a lot of the people you work with are not getting bespoke boots made or that sort of thing.
No.
But do you see a similar kind of innovation in social services, in the delivery of social services, and people thinking about how can I make a difference in a different way?
Oh, absolutely. I was just reflecting, the growth of social services as an industry of employment, and I was sitting on an interview panel last week, or the week before, and recruiting for street outreach workers, so gorgeous young youth workers, university educated, to get out on the streets of Melbourne very late at night, working with the people who are severely disengaged and disadvantaged, and I'm there and I'm talking to this lovely youth worker that has a man beard and tattoos and the man bun, and we get to the end. When you get to the end of the interview and you say, "Have you got any questions for us?" And he leant in and he said, "Yes. What's your operating platform?" And I said, "My operating platform?" I said, "Well, we use a client-centred approach for a whole of person." He said, No. What's your IT operating platform? I want to know if I can get my job done. And for us in community services, it really throws up an interesting dilemma about how do we engage in human services by giving people the tools. It used to be, when I started, you just needed to be able to talk to somebody. That doesn't work anymore, because we know that it's fascinating that, Peter, that I was just looking at some research coming out of Queensland, but it's certainly not my experience that it would be different in Victoria, that homeless young people under the age of 25, 80% have a smartphone.
And I know there's research from the UK too that says that young people will forego eating for several days
Correct.
in order to top up their phone.
Yeah, I think that's at about 62.
Because social connection is so important.
Well, what that means is that, I don't know if anyone here's got teenagers, but you know that there's a crisis if they call you, because most of the time they'll text. So we now have youth workers that are counselling and engaging with their clients via text message. That's a really interesting way to be working in social services. It's also a way that people now connect. So the reason why homeless people have smartphones, and the reason why they prioritise their very precious, meagre weekly budget on IT rather than food, is because if you don't have an address, your phone number is your stable contact, and your Facebook or your Twitter handle is where people can pop in and visit you and keep your connection to your community. So that's now your stable home.
And do you see at the mission, what we might call the losers out of the knowledge jobs equation?
Yeah, it's interesting, because it's exciting. Knowledge economy is really exciting for people who are traditionally excluded from the school ties and the networks. So, the big hope of developing an app in your garage that Google's going to come along and buy for $1 million is just as accessible if you're living in Housing Commission in Braybrook as it is if you've got the best education that money can buy in this country. So there are opportunities that don't rely on having the right doors opened and the right social connections and moving in the right circles.
So there are new possibilities opening up.
There are. So it is exciting. That said, the social skills that people, and Bruno, I absolutely agree with you, the social skills that people have enable movement in really any sector. And as you were talking, I was really reflecting on to be a good beggar in Melbourne, you need to be social. You need to engage with people. You need to make eye contact. You need to say g'day. You need to know that Bernard comes down at 10:30 every day to get his morning coffee, and I'm going to be sitting here and make a conversation with you, and you'll slip me a tenner. So,
Good luck.
but being social gets you very far in life. Now, we also know that when people are subjected to trauma in their developmental years, in those formative years, the way that our brains develop is that it's not made in our interest. You develop your brain from the back to the forward. Now, the back is all about the how do you feel and your adrenaline and fight and flight, and the front is where you actually start making decisions. But you start your growth back there and you sort of finish it there in later teenage, early adult. The issue is that as a child, if you're unsafe and traumatised and abused, and don't have the upbringing that is the right of children to have, your brain development is fundamentally changed. And you spend a lot of time in that back part of your brain that tells you, I am unsafe and I can't think around the front of my brain to think through consequences and to start getting engaged in rational thinking. So we end up with adults who spend a lot of that space in fight or flight. Now, that's very hard to be social and present yourself.
Doesn't really go with affability, does it?
It doesn't.
Yeah.
Look, it just doesn't. And they're behind the 8 ball to start with.
I think it's really interesting, and Bernard, I'll come to you on this, but anyone else is welcome to jump in on the question as well, and that is, in theory, my microphone, I'll try and keep still so I don't make those nasty noises. Maybe I'm waving my hands too much. In theory, the digital era means the death of distance, and we've heard Marcus talk about this. You can be a jeweller in Newcastle and be selling to someone in Alaska or whatever it may be, but in practice, you talked about it yourself. What we see is firms congregating close together. The finance industry is the most connected industry you can imagine, and yet it's clustered around Collins Street. So the face-to-face stuff remains supremely important, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. In fact, I've done some work on this through the Australian censuses. You would think with the digitisation and computers and whatever that more people would be working from home. At the 2001 census, 4% of the Australian non-farm workforce, you've got to take out farmers because they all work from home, so 4% of the non-farm workforce worked from home on census night in 2001. In 2006, I thought, there's going to be a big change because the arrival of broadband and whatever and personal computers. The results came out and it was about 4.1%. I thought I have to wait another 5 years. 2011, it's still 4%. In fact, there has been no material change in the proportion of the non-farm workforce that are working from home. What I think is happening, and I can certainly see this in our workplace, KPMG, is that people will work from home in an arbitrary way. I've got a report to write. I don't want to be here at the office and disturbed by everyone. I'll write it at home, or I'll write it in a cafe, or in a hotel, or whatever. So that's that mobility to work rather than working from home. And the reason why, as a consultant, you would not want to work from home in a permanent sense is because it's not whether you can do the work, it's surety of workflow. And as soon as your relationship with the person who provides you with work out of Collins Street, that person gets promoted, sent somewhere else, you don't know the next person. That person doesn't know you. They don't know that they can trust you with a contract to deliver, but they know they can trust that person because they've been chatting with them. So this interpersonal relationship is absolutely critical for longevity. Yes, you can do it for a while, and I think that's the reason why we've only got 4% of the workforce permanently working from home. But I think, maybe 20% or even 30% work from home occasionally, bits of time. But you'll need to be able to work from home, from a hotel, from a coffee shop. It's that fluidity. And if you look at the themes here, it's fluidity, agility, mobility, flexibility, this idea of being able to pitch yourself is absolutely critical. One job that has contracted the most in the 21st century is the job of secretary. No one has a secretary anymore. They are executive assistants, and the role has shifted. A secretary takes dictation, types whatever. An executive assistant liaises, interfaces, manages diaries, manages staff or whatever. And so if you have a view, I'm a secretary, my job's been stopped, and someone says, your job as a secretary doesn't apply anymore, but if you introduce yourself to those people over there, there's a job going as an office manager. So, no, and I'm a secretary. I will wait. And besides, I don't know those people over there. I'm not going to bowl up to them and introduce myself. And therefore, I'll wait for the job of a secretary to come up. You are in a siloed thinking, and you are not future-proofing your career.
And you're going to be waiting a long time.
Or you wait a long time, or you say, no worries, that's fine. Hi, my name is such and such. I have experience in this, and I can apply those skills there. Affable, fluid, agile, mobile, sociable. Take a skill set and apply it to a new circumstance. That will future-proof your career.
Janine, another side of this is that, and Bernard mentioned it in his presentation, is that the big knowledge companies, the ones who are demanding the high skills, are concentrated in the CBD. Now, does that mean that and if we expect that trend to continue, does that mean that we're going to have an increasingly divided city, which we already see, but sort of a knowledge-rich and wealthy inner circle, and a less knowledge-rich or knowledge-poorer and less wealthy fringe?
Yeah, well, it is very important to, when it comes to urban planning, to take all this into account. Now, these industries, the finance and insurance, the professional services and so forth, they are some of the big growth industries in our economy, and they do tend to agglomerate, they do tend to congregate to the centre of the city. They are the types of jobs that, I agree with Bernard, you'd think you could do them at home, writing reports and so forth, but it is human nature to want to have face-to-face interaction, and it turns out to be very important. So I think it's going to be very important that these views are taken on in urban planning. The population of Melbourne is set almost to double over the next generation, and there is a lot of talk around of creating the polycentric city with the different hubs of activity, and it is the type of thing that could go quite wrong.
Well, we've tried. I mean, it's been on the talk for a while, hasn't it? A centre in Dandenong and a centre in Frankston or wherever it may be.
Absolutely,
and you can see the attraction of it. And Sydney has it more with Parramatta and North Sydney and so on.
And from a planning perspective, as the benevolent dictator, you might see that is a good idea. It reduces congestion and so forth. But as a business decision, why would you base yourself in Dandenong, accessing the population of Dandenong for your workforce and missing out on the population of all of the west of Melbourne? But why would you base yourself in the west and miss out on the population from the east? It makes a lot of sense for business to want to situate itself in the centre of the city, and this is something that is going to need to be taken very seriously, I think. So, I mean, you have two competing sort of factors in the expansion of a city. The agglomeration effect is generally good for economic activity, but as the city expands, the congestion, the transport, the general difficulty of it all is bad for the city. But it's hard to know naturally what size the city ought to be, and
the old economy job generators, the broad meadows, car manufacturing plants or whatever, they were located in the suburbs. They were close to where people lived. Elizabeth in South Australia. So this is a real conundrum, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But it does seem that those more high knowledge jobs are attracted to the centre where they've got access to a much wider pool of workers, and perhaps those manufacturing type jobs, which are in decline, are more situated around the outsides of the cities.
There's some interesting thinking coming out of America at the moment about 3D printing and how that might shape industrial location across Western cities. You could argue that between, say, 1950 and 2020, 60, 70 years or so, was a phase of automation in the developed world, and we had car manufacturing plants pop up in Melbourne at that time, or in Geelong. In the last 30 years, in pursuit of cheap labour, that then gets outsourced to Guangzhou. And that continues for maybe 20 or 30 years or so. The next phase, between 2030 and 2060, is where 3D printing gets to the point where, why would you manufacture a car in Guangzhou with labour? Why not do it completely through automation, through 3D printing? And why wouldn't you have a 3D printing plant at each city, at each market, and you would actually print the bits for a car or for whatever it is? So 3D printing has the capacity, the theory goes, to take back all of those manufacturing plants that were outsourced to Guangzhou and similar, and to bring them back into the heartland.
So we see in like the development we had with newspapers, which of course no longer exist in the same form, but newspapers printing in locations rather than delivering all from one central
that's
location.
right. I mean, the idea that manufacturing goes off to a low-cost manufacturer, that logic prevails, but not forever. The circumstances might change by which that manufacturing product comes back to the core market. And the argument is that you'd want it near the core market where design, head office, you don't have transportation logistical problem. You can almost do just-in-time print runs to make sure you're getting the right product tweaked to the Melbourne market in exact the right number at that time. That, to me, might be the way we organise manufacturing 2030 to 2060. That would have an impact on job location in Melbourne.
That may be so. That may be so. But the very development that you describe is the further automation of the manufacturing process. So even if the manufacturing process, in a very changed way, comes back to Melbourne, it might not really bring jobs.
No, you won't have a factory assembly lines. We have distribution, warehousing, design. There will be jobs around that, not as many as a Broadmeadows factory plant. I think the Norlane Ford factory, back in the early 80s, I was working in Geelong at the time, had something like 5,000 people on a factory line. I mean, there's only 125,000 jobs in Geelong, and 5,000 of them were in one assembly line. So I don't think you'll actually ever see that. That probably belonged to the late 20th century. We'll never see it again.
And Marcus, you've seen this process at work in Newcastle, of course, where the steelworks and the shipbuilding industries, which were maybe at their height in the 70s, declined, and the jobs went with them. Now, one response to that is to say, okay, we need to bring, Guggenheim to Newcastle and have some massive cultural attraction, and the same thing's been suggested for Geelong, in fact. You're pretty suspicious of those sorts of initiatives, I think.
Yeah, I'm suspicious of the big fix. I'm suspicious of any kind of plan that's all about one, big solution imposed from on high. But I want to go back a step, actually, and I think it's worth. I mean, we sort of talk about the past, we talk about disruption, we talk about the future, and we sort of forget about the process in between. I think that reminder of Newcastle is important in that context, and what Bernard just said. When I was a kid in the 80s, the BHP Steelworks in Newcastle employed about 20,000 people. Closed down by the late 90s. So that's 20,000 jobs out of a community of, a few hundred thousand. So literally everyone knew someone who worked at the steelworks. Someone's family worked at the steelworks. When I left school...
And those steelworkers were also the people that shopped in the local shops.
Oh, well, my dad's business. My dad sold cars to steelworkers. His business went belly up with the steelworks, When I left school, there was 40-something% youth unemployment in Newcastle. No one I knew had a job. It was just like I did not know anyone with a job. So I think it's worth, you can sort of have these kind of, abstract sort of discussions about, where are the jobs of the future going to be. It's also worth remembering between here and there's an awful lot of collateral damage in getting there.
So this idea of disruption, which is kind of a buzzword these days, if we look at that, I mean, it's really another version of Schumpeter's creative destruction. The process. But creative destruction is a very damaging and messy process.
How do you ameliorate the human effects of constant change? I think that to me seems to be the given for whatever environment we're going into, is the pace of change is accelerating. So then part of the question becomes, as a society, how do we respond to that process of near constant disruptive change? What does that mean for how we provide social services, respond to people, the skills we give people, and the support we give people?
Marcus, your story reminds me of a young man that I once met who he was 14 and 9 months old, and which is the legal age to work. And all he ever wanted to be was a panel beater. And if he could just be a panel beater, he would have reached his life goals right there. So at Melbourne City Mission, we went through our database of donors, and I found a panel beater who supports our organisation. I gave him a call. Ron, he's in Swan Street, if you ever need a panel beater, he's terrific. And I talked him into giving this young guy a go. And he said, okay, I'll put him on a trial for a couple of weeks, and if he's any good, I'll look at an apprenticeship. So I took him down there in the morning, and his brand new youth worker bought shoes and overalls and, nervous as anything. And this is a really polite kid, wouldn't say boo to a goose. And, found it even difficult to make eye contact with adults. Very polite, quiet young man. Anyway, dropped him off, all great, and got a phone call by 10 o'clock, and Ron is completely irate with Melbourne City Mission. I'm never donating another cent to you people. This cretin that you've put down in my workshop, come and take him. Oh God, really? You're talking about the same person? So I drive down there, and the young man's in the corner crying, and Ron doesn't want to, he's angry. So I go and pick him up, and we go to Macca's, which is where all good youth workers go when there's a crisis. And like you, this young man never knew anyone that had a job, not just in that part of his life, ever. He grew up in public housing. No one in his family had ever had a job. No neighbour had ever had a job. Extended family, the only people he knew that had a job was me and the teacher. That's the only people he knew with jobs. And when he went to Ron, he thought that when men go to work, they spit and they swear and they fight. That's what men do, real men do that at work. And he took on the persona of a working man, because that's what... And he thought that a boss was like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. That was his understanding of employment. So to never understand the nature of employment. Now, can I tell you, lovely bloke, really terrific, took him back, we negotiated, and he worked out his apprenticeship, and he's now happily married with 2 little kids.
And a panel beater.
And a panel beater, and reached life goals. But, this young man, he won't have a dozen jobs. He has hit his ability to be a panel beater, and he will not look to be anything else in life. And his understanding of transferability and employability is developing and growing. But his starting base is, we should be shocked by that. In this country, in this city, a kid grew up without knowing anyone with a job.
Look, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. If you want to get involved or make a comment, we'll keep it brief and to the point. But just, that raises the question, doesn't it, Bernard, of how we get this affability, the sort of soft skills you talked about. How given that you think they're not easy things to teach in school?
I agree, and I actually think that you learn them at home. I said at a forum just a week or so ago that I think you learn it at home, as a 13 or 14-year-old, and I was pulled up very smartly by a mother who said, no, I think it starts at about 6 or 7. And so if you come from a family that is, to be fair, dysfunctional or not traditional in that sense, then it would be very hard to actually model that behaviour. And I certainly hope that this young man doesn't have to ever apply for another job. But because if Ron's business goes under, if there are driverless cars and there are no crashes in the future, then that business in Swan Street does not exist. And this kid's out of a job by 30, but he has never actually put himself in a position of walking up to a bloke or a woman and saying, I'm applying for this job, here's my skill sets, here's how I can fit into your organisation. Now, many people here say, well, that's not such a hard thing, but it is. It's an extraordinarily hard thing to do if you have no self-confidence, you've never done it before, you're inarticulate. That, to me, is something that as a parent you can be doing for your kids from the age of 5. Fluidity, flexibility, agility, affability, fit-in ability. is really what you need to do in a fluid, changing workplace.
Can I just add to that though, Bernard? Like we were talking before about the growth in jobs, and the growth in unskilled jobs is in my sector. So how are we going to teach these skills if that's the growth in the unskilled? So if you think about what level of skill does that young kid need? He needs the best that we as a community can give. So it says something about our values when the growth in low-skilled jobs are the people who are supposed to be putting the band-aids on and teaching these skills to people who haven't had the ability to learn that before. It's an interesting dilemma that we have.
Okay, we've got the microphone. We've got lots of questions. We'll start over here. Yeah.
I got the mic.
Yeah.
My name's Jeff Robinson. I work as a consulting engineer designing green buildings and sustainable communities. And I wonder if the panel could talk about what they see the opportunities are in the green economy. You know, we've got a very heavily carbon-based economy. We don't live such healthy lifestyles. Health and eternal youth is one thing that people seem to be. I looked at that scale up there and it looked like healthcare was going to be a big area. But I think there's lots and lots of opportunities around helping design and refurbish buildings and bring in renewable energy. And I'd love to hear what you think.
Thanks.
Well, I think if you put a broad theme, wellness, well-being, health, care, professional services, and sustainability. Sustainability in the way we live, in our workplaces, in our lifestyles. I think we're certainly becoming far more educated today than we were, say, 10, 20 years ago. And the sustainability bar and the lifestyle expectation that goes with that is continually rising. So, yes, I would say you're right. The type of houses, the workplaces, our shopping centres will all have a sustainability overlay. I might also say that I would think one of the great jobs of the future, or industries of the future, will be water management, water harvesting, water efficiency, water purity, water distribution would be a business to be in. We should be world's best practice in water management, harvesting, distribution, reticulation. Driest continent on Earth, or habitable continent on Earth. We should be brilliant at this stuff, and we should be cultivating that expertise. You can't export water, but you can export the expertise, the consulting expertise to go to wherever it is. There's a drought in California at the moment. We should be exporting Australian expertise to the Americans. Say, this is how you manage it.
Just as a follow-up on that, because I mean the other implication in a lot of what we said is that we need better education, better skills building, which requires investment in education. So, Janine, health and human services, traditionally largely government funded. Some of the innovations that our questioner Jeff was talking about in moving towards greener buildings and greener technologies, again, we're going to need to pay for that. How do we fund all this?
Yeah, it is a concern. It is a good question. One of the things I've been concerned about, particularly in the last couple of years, is that the government budget's forecasts are predicated on GDP growth that is very, very strong, given where we're at the moment. To reach the government's sort of forecast for GDP by 2020, we need extremely high productivity growth. It's not clear where that's going to come from. And, I mean, if they forecast wrong, so what? Well, the big so what is that they've got their budget wrong. So I think that is a big concern.
Because, I mean, you see us moving into a lower rate of growth, like as other developed nations have, Japan and so on.
Yeah, I think that we're coming off the end of the mining investment boom, which probably masked problems that we've had that have been latent for a while in terms of fairly low productivity growth. If you're producing something that the rest of the world wants and is willing to pay 8 times as much for, then that's great. And that's what happened with iron ore. The price of iron ore went up by 8 times. So that made us pretty rich for a little while.
But it's not going to happen again,
It's
right?
not going to happen again. It's coming off now. And some of these latent problems that have been going on for perhaps the last 10, 15 years are now coming to the fore. So I do think that that is a concern.
So that raises the whole issue about whether we pay for more things ourselves or whether we pay more taxes or reorganise our tax base.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we're living now with income tax rates that are historically quite low. It's a bit of a legacy of John Howard's tax cuts, which were brought in at the height of the mining boom. They were sort of appropriate then, but they're no longer appropriate now. So I think that is a problem that does need to be addressed, either by reinstating those income taxes or by coming at it from another angle, GST or so forth.
Yep. Broad-based land tax is always my favourite solution.
And the other one, which very sadly has really been taken off the table, was the carbon tax. And that feeds into the question about sustainability and green buildings. Now, I do think that there was a great upsurge in construction workers as we had to increase our capacity to produce iron ore and coal and LNG and so forth. There are now a lot of construction workers around. There's a great opportunity to greenify those buildings in terms of having a lot of labour supply around to do that. Now, greenness is not necessarily the concern of private companies or private individuals, but the government acting as an agent on our behalf, as the owner of the air, the clean water and so forth, needs to work out how they're going to price it and how they're going to stimulate that sort of activity.
Okay, let's take another question just here. Yeah, thanks.
My name is Albert Rivero. I'm from the finance and technology area, and actually I was working with global investment banks in different cities around the world. Now, I have a question. When I was working in all these financial technologies companies, they actually outsource a lot of all these works to India or China. If you look at the manufacturing sector, they also outsource that too. But when I was looking at your statistic about the job growth in different industry, it seems that we still growing a lot of these technology jobs in Melbourne or in the city here. So is it because, one, we have a better negotiating power to keep those jobs in the city, or we just don't know about how to attract those so-called different skill set of job to the Melbourne city? For example, in manufacturing, I think it was Steve Jobs who once said to Obama that those jobs will never return to America. But the reason is not just about cost, it's about the know-how. How to make the iPhone, how to make the car, how to cheat the carbon emission.
Okay. All right, thanks.
I think you've raised a really interesting issue here, that we have seen the outsourcing of the manufacturing process to low-cost labour because of low-cost labour. The next step in the process, where we have shed blue-collar labour, for example, the car manufacturing plant out at Broadmeadows or down at Norlane, there's hardly anyone there these days because that job has been now done in Guangzhou. The next level, and it might be the next 10 years, 2015 to 2030 or thereabouts, is where artificial intelligence comes in and erodes jobs in the low-level white-collar industry, accounting, processing tasks. So the impact on the professional services financial industry, if you like, could be the next wave. And as artificial intelligence and robotics erode blue-collar jobs and then repetitive white-collar jobs, then that is going to be an issue going forward. Coming back to the point made by Peter previously about taxes and so forth, if that is the view, no blue-collar jobs and low white-collar jobs are eroded or offshored or converted to mechanisation, how do we organise a society where not everyone works? What do you do? You could argue that, the only way rich, affable geeks, because they're the ones with the jobs, the only way they can actually live in a meaningful society is if everyone gets to share in the prosperity. Everyone believes they can have a go at sharing in the prosperity. That panel beater kid probably did not believe as a 12-year-old that he had a shot at even getting a job. I want a society not where everyone is equal. I want everyone to work damn hard and to respect everyone's talent, but you've got to have a society where average people, poor people, are given a fair quality of life. And that's the bigger picture question that we as a society need to argue or talk about. Wealth distribution and redistribution. Not equalisation, but what is a fair way to organise society? That's the question we should be asking.
And I don't know if other people heard the aside there, but there was an aside from the audience. If we don't do what, as Bernard is suggesting, the jobs growth is going to be in prisons.
Well, I mean, you get social unrest, social dysfunction. You get this sort of anti-business sentiment, big business, big banks, big oil, big coal, big government, big this, big that. I can't relate to that. I'm never going to get a job. I'll feel disaffected. And I'll connect with a lot of other people that feel disaffected. What sort of Melbourne is that to live in 2030, 2040? It's not the Melbourne that I want to live in. And even if you are, you know, a super smart geek living in wherever and making a mint, it's not the sort of place you'd really want to live.
Marcus, you want?
I was just curious whether it's any coincidence that, you know, the figures that you showed of the huge growth rates before being in services like health, education, they're ones where the government still plays a huge role.
Yeah, this has actually been pointed out to me by private sector business people. Say, you know, the growth sectors are actually where taxes fund education and health, who is actually creating new wealth in Australia. And this comes back to this issue of entrepreneurship and our ability to create and innovate jobs and celebrate those people who can do it, who can create a job from nothing.
Can I just add just another follow on to that? When I looked at your list of the top 10 companies in Australia, 3 or 4 of them began life as government monopolies.
Commonwealth Bank.
Yeah. Commonwealth Bank, Telstra, there was another one, CSL.
But Marcus, I wanted to pick you up, come back to you on that, because the kind of ideas you're looking at in your series and in your book about Newcastle are in fact very much about entrepreneurialism and initiative. I mean, you say that more important than capital or government subsidies is just creating the conditions so people can get on with stuff.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is one of the lessons I've learned through the work that I've been doing the last few years, is that in any community these days, there's a huge number of people who want to have a go at doing something. You know, increasingly the capacity to test an idea, try an idea, be inspired by lots of ideas, find a market, find an audience is becoming much, much more distributed. The problem that I noticed going back to Newcastle when I started doing this stuff was that you had 150 empty buildings in the 2 main streets of Newcastle. The people in that city who actually had the practical capacity to lease them, do something, start a business in them, were a really small subset of the population. They were the people who had capital, who could take a 5-year lease, who could buy a property, who had lawyers, who had compliance, they could jump the hoops, whatever it may be. I think one of the key questions we need to ask ourselves is how do we create a dynamic where that capacity to try things, test ideas, do things is much more broadly Distributed than just people who hang out at geek networking events or people who have access to capital or expertise.
I mean, one of the points you make is in a failing market, doing the same things we've done before isn't going to work. We need to do something different.
Absolutely, and you know, and again, go back to my thing about the big fix. I mean, the idea is not to kind of pick on a couple of big ideas and pick winners. The idea is to create fertile ground and run 100 little experiments and see what grows.
There's not one big solution. There's lots of them. Okay, sorry, you have the microphone.
Gillian Kenny, founder of Mackinum and of Power of Engineering, and my question actually fits in perfectly into where the conversation is right now. So Bernard, in your opening statement, you mentioned that we need to create a culture of entrepreneurship and enterprise, but concurrently we need to create a culture where we celebrate failure. So I would love to hear your thoughts about how we as a society, how companies and individuals can actually create the conditions for that sort of culture to arise.
Perfect. I wanted to answer that question, just needed to be posed. How would we create a culture of enterprise? I think the Melbourne City Council does a fantastic job in this, jobs of the knowledge economy. Well, I mean, it's a fantastic topic and a great idea. I've got a great other idea, Austin. The next thing I'm looking for the City Council to sponsor is a festival of left field thinking, of creative ideas, of enterprise. I want to identify the best new business created in this state, in this city, in this municipality over the last 12 months. It doesn't need to be a Mark Zuckerberg. It can be a 28-year-old who's created a hairdressing business, now got 5 apprentices. I want to celebrate those people that actually create something from nothing. That's entrepreneurship. And then celebrating culture of failure. When I was a teenager, I used to play basketball, men's basketball. So when you have a free throw, if you miss the first one, the protocol is that all your teammates come along and pat you on the back and say, "Don't worry, you'll get it next time." And I've always liked that aspect of basketball. Don't worry about it, we have faith in you. That's what I want to hear. Okay, so that hairdressing business fell over. But that's all right. Here's a mentor program sponsored by the Melbourne City Council where some retired old guy can mentor you in getting it next time. You know, you should have been putting more money aside for tax. That's probably what you should have been doing. We'll give it a go next time. And that sort of community bringing together and sharing of expertise to deliver an enterprise outcome. And also, on top of all this, just losing that person's successful, he must have done this or she must have done that. We need to lose that. You can't create new businesses. America can do it because they actually admire people who create something. And I think we need to go the whole American bit, but I think we need to shift our thinking towards celebrating and acknowledging enterprise.
Just one little very practical point. One of the lessons I've learned is if you reduce the cost of failure, more people will try stuff. And there are policy settings through which you can do that.
I think part of my thinking also, though, is we've spent a lot of tonight talking about the individual and talking about the individual attributes or qualities of how do I future-proof myself. And I think we also need to acknowledge what's the role of being a good corporate citizen. So if you are one of those top 10 corporates, and I can tell you a lot of them very actively support Melbourne City Mission, but what is your role if the way you are operating in a community is by its nature creating winners and losers? What then is your obligation to be addressing and supporting strategies and mechanisms by which the losers can turn around and start to engage in a more positive way? And if we are accepting the reality that not everyone will have a job, that not everyone will work 38 hours a week, not everyone will have that. So for the ones who are benefiting and profiting from that new structure, what is the obligation of a good corporate citizen to be able to be finding meaningful existence for those who aren't engaged in workforce?
I'd just recommend to people to Google John Maynard Keynes' Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, written in 1930 at the height of the Great Depression, saying, don't worry, GDP is going to double and then quadruple within 100 years. He underestimated. I mean, it was much quicker than that in which it happened. And by the 1970s or 80s, he said, we'll be working 17 hours a week. We won't have to work any more than that. Problem of scarcity will have been solved, and we'll spend our time doing more important things. Now, where did he go wrong? Let's take another question. Yeah.
Cormick. I'm from Monash Uni, and it actually ties into what you just said, because that's what I'd like to know as well. Where did we go wrong? Because we're celebrating a lot, and you have, Bernard, in what you've said, celebrated a lot about America and holding that up as a role model. If we're going to create a community that looks after people, and where that growth is in the social sector with people with social services needing to look after children and the elderly, we need to do something to change the perception in society that they're undesirable jobs, because at the moment the perception is that they're undesirable, they're low valued, they're low paid, and most of the people, or many of the people that work in them these days, are people who are newly arrived to Australia, which it's great to get diversity, but it's also important that people coming from some of these other industries can feel that there's enough value in those jobs to want them. The point with that, and that I would also like you to discuss a little bit, is talking about America and holding them up as a shining light, which in some ways they certainly are. We're only looking at the capitalist element of it. We should also be admiring and holding up countries like Norway and other Scandinavian nations who are doing so much in the way of social reform, just as a small, for instance, using things creatively. They have someone over there recently set up a childcare centre in an aged care facility. And that's the sort of thinking we should be thinking of, not just about the money. The money will come if we look after our people.
Yes, well, I'm at pains to say there's a lot about America that I do not like. I think that we would be doing ourselves a disservice if we did not say, that element is in stark contrast and we might need to rethink or reframe our thinking. It's an element of entrepreneurship that I think we need to aspire to. Certainly not the full bit about America. I'm very happy with Australia, thank you very much. I want the Australian lifestyle and attitude tweaked a little bit. That's what I want from that point of view. I agree with you about care workers. I think we should reframe society's view about the value that they make, the tremendous value that they make to society, in the same way that I think society needs to reframe the way they view business and ethical business. People that create jobs out of nothing, who pay their taxes and who give back to society. I want to identify those people and say, these people are actually doing the right thing. We need to celebrate those. So yes, I think there's learnings there on both sides. And in Scandinavia, there's other learnings. Sweden is a community of 12 million people. How many global businesses come out of Sweden? Volvo, Saab, there's about 5 or 6 of them. Now name Australian global businesses. Name them. BHP. It's not really consumer goods, no. It's American. It's actually American. Name them. Foster's, Billabong, no. Foster's been bought out, Billabong's been bought out. BHP was actually merged with South African. Rio, actually based in London. Come on, more. We're 24 million people, the Swedes are only 12 mil. Go to Switzerland, 8 mil. Where do you stop with Switzerland? UBS, Roche. We are not players in that space. We need to come out of our island and start thinking globally. I think we have the talent, we just haven't harnessed it.
Can I add just one thing to that, though? Yep. We're doing some research at Melbourne City Mission and trying to cost the cost of young people who are disengaged and homeless in Melbourne, here and now. And by looking at the cost of keeping those young people homeless, damaged, drugged, criminalised, unemployed, sick, over a 10-year period, $9.2 million of our taxpayers' money to keep them sick and homeless. 9.2
billion.
Million.
Right.
Sorry, that was a million.
I was clarifying.
Yeah. 9.2 mil over 10 years, and the outcome is they will still be unemployed, sick, homeless. That's a big investment that we're making in our young people. Exactly.
But it's more than that. It's more than the money. It's like damaged lives.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
The right thing to do.
The social cost is enormous. So when we look at what value do we put on our social services, well, there's a measuring stick right there. We will pay that, but we won't invest that.
Janine? Yeah.
Well, yeah, just on that, I think that's a great tragedy. It really is. But it's very difficult for business to be able to bring those young people out of that situation without some help. And I think it's really important that the government invests in those people through top-up scheme, income top-up, subsidised sort of apprenticeships and so forth for those people. I mean, your panel beater, I don't know if Ray paid all his wages or if he had some help, but I really think he deserved some help for taking a punt on young people like that, and I think it's really important. It's a much more useful way to spend the money.
And we often hear about the lack of sufficient investment in higher education, but in fact universities have done very well compared to the TAFE sector. And yeah. Okay, another question.
Does this work?
Yeah, just they'll turn it on when you talk.
My name's Adam McGinnis. I work in large insurance, corporate insurance, data and information, so I understand about those low-level white-collar jobs and the opportunities to, as you said, Bernard, before, take away the mundane tasks and perhaps enable people to pursue their loves as a job, and that would be fantastic. And Marcus, you spoke about the disruption and the downside of disruption. It's really interesting. So I love a lot of the thinking, but off the back of the Occupy movement a few years ago, and only last week in The Age a report appeared, we still see 50% of the world's wealth controlled by 1% of the population. So particularly for some of you who engage with large corporates, you Bernard, through an international consultancy, where that wealth exists, we saw on the left-hand side of that slide up there internationally, and we have a lot of those products coming to Australia and being sold for minimal profit in Australia and the money shipped offshore, tax collections not occurring and so forth. So the question is at that level where that wealth is congregating, is it understood that in order to facilitate transition in a reasonably orderly fashion and get some, not equality, what was the word you used, more levelling?
Fairness was the word.
Fairness.
Yeah.
Is there recognition at that level?
You're asking me for my insight into what Apple and Google, their attitude to tax.
Or the large Australian corporates you work with, for example.
Look, I have no idea. I mean, I'm not a tax accountant, not even an accountant. I have no idea, but my observation in business is that if you're running a big business and you're in Australia and you're running a business and you want that business to be around like you're running a bank or you're running an insurance company, you're running a housing company or construction company, you want that business to be there in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. You've got to do the right thing by the community in order to live in a harmonious, symbiotic relationship with the community. You're not some small fly-by-night operator that can come in and do someone over and then move on. If you're a big business, it just makes good business sense to do the right thing and to operate efficiently so that you get to remain in that country and to deliver reasonable returns to your shareholders for years into the future. That to me is like, it's fairly basic sort of stuff. But to suggest that they're all out there trying to get as much, it just does not work. I mean, they'd be out of business overnight. Didn't
the financial crisis demonstrate?
Sorry, hang on. Yeah. No, just Marcus, and then...
I just wanted to observe, didn't the financial crisis demonstrate there was a whole bunch of people operating on short-term incentives, not thinking about the long-term damage?
Well, take it up with the Americans. I mean, what am I am I the person defending,
No, but you made an observation that they weren't doing that. I just thought there was examples of that.
I said my experience was that I have no experience with people in Wall Street, for example, that were doing that. My experience in business, and I had some experience in business, is that at the uppermost level, people have this view of trying to create a sustainable relationship with the Australian people, the Australian economy. Now, you have then brought in Wall Street and are calling me to account for Wall Street.
No. I'm just questioning your logic.
Okay, well, my logic is to the Australian people, if you're running a big business, you need to do the right thing if you want to sustain and create a sustainable business. Now, you might disagree with that. I'll put it to the people. Does that seem like a logical sort of approach that anyone in big business should take?
Go on, Janine.
No, well, I do think there is a prevailing culture in Australia, perhaps not, probably right at all levels of society, really, business and individuals and so forth, that we should minimise our tax. And I think that's a really dangerous or damaging type of culture, particularly when you find that probably the average size of the tax return is roughly equal to the average size of the accounting bill. The finance and insurance sector in this economy is worth about 8% of GDP. Now that is, that's great if you work there and so forth, but that is 8% of this country's resources dedicated to facilitating the flow between saving and investment. Is that too much? They're running the margins and so forth. So I do think that there are some sort of prevailing cultures that we have that I'd like to see change.
So as well as as Bernard's idea of a developing a culture that is more entrepreneurial and celebrates that sort of risk and success and achievement and indeed failure, as we discussed. Also one that has, I guess, the kind of stuff Sherri's talking about, a broader, also celebrates that sense of our obligation for the winners. Let's take one last question and then we need to wind up. Yeah.
G'day, my name's Leon. I've been through a number of jobs. Presently I'm a carpenter, and I think going around different jobs in your career is hard work and also frustrating at times. And when the graph went up about the economies employing the most people, it was obvious to me that it was Keynesian economics of education, health, and I can't remember what the other one was. It surprised me, Bernard, when you said you didn't realise that till a colleague of yours brought it up. And therefore I thought, aren't you a Keynesian and aren't you in the knowledge economy to have known that? Because I saw it straight away. And the other thing with big industry, it's fine where I hear people talking about entrepreneurship, but they actually aren't, they don't do it. You asked before the Melbourne City Council should put up other forums. Why does KPMG do it? Why don't they have a forum of, don't be afraid of failing, who are the next big ticket item people? Your organisation can do it, other big organisations do it. Again, you're relying on government money, council money.
Have you got a question?
My question is, under the current economic system, I can't see things changing and the gap between rich and poor getting bigger. I can't see it changing, no matter how a positive spin you put on it, that people should get out there.
That's a comment rather than a question, but I'll...
I think that ideas like festivals of entrepreneurial thinking is something that should be, it's a role of government. I think at a state level or a local government level, I think that businesses and individuals should support that in a broader sense. I don't think it falls on an individual or an individual business to do something in a broader sense from that community. I do think that it's everyone in the community needs to pay their taxes, make their contribution, and to actually put ideas forward. I think the role of government is best served where they provide the framework, and the framework would be, here is a forum to discuss the knowledge jobs of the future. Here is a forum to identify from the broader community the best new businesses that we think need to be celebrated, identified, and hopefully used as role models to create the jobs of the future, so that you don't think that, well, I don't think this is ever going to change. I think if we all have that view that the system ain't ever going to change, then I think it's actually quite a dark view of the future. I have a positive view of the future. I have faith in our creativity, our innovation. All we need is the right framework, and we hopefully can actually create those businesses, create those jobs, and create the society that we want for the future.
I'll just invite final comments from our other three panellists in that idea about what the future might look like.
I'm just going to jump in there and respond, because I think it's a great idea, and I want to announce that the 5 inner city councils this week have launched makers.melbourne, which is a website for makers to actually identify themselves and be able to market themselves. So I commend people to actually look at that website. It's only just started. And I think from that website, which is actually a research project separately, but from that website, we'll be able to find the stories that you're looking for to actually celebrate. So I think that will be a good response.
Okay, thank you, Austin. So final comments from our panellists on, what does the future look like? Are you optimistic? Do you think we can put a framework in place that means we will have more flourishing lives, essentially?
I'm positive about Australia, positive about our future, very positive about Generation Y, the most educated generation in history, the most digitally connected generation in history. I think if we can harness their natural creativity and entrepreneurship, then we can create or help create the businesses of the future. And if we can create a society that is fair, where everyone makes a contribution, then we'll build a better Melbourne, a better society for the future.
Janine?
Yeah, I share your optimism, Bernard, about Generation Y. I do see that there will be a lot of growth in the professional occupations and so forth. About the Generation Y is the most educated generation we've ever had, but it doesn't mean that everybody is, and I do worry. I think it's an ongoing concern that we will we will always have to deal with is how we treat those who have the potential to be left behind. And I do think that's an ongoing concern, and it's a concern that should be all of our concern, and that should be addressed through the government, through government policies to help people, particularly through their access to employment. It's not really up to employers to take on all the risk of employing kids like your panel beater, but and they should be helped and encouraged to do so through policy. I just wanted to make a few points though about the type of growth that we've experienced in the last 15, 20 years. Yes, it has been quite biased towards health and education, but government spending as a percentage of GDP has stayed roughly constant throughout. It sits at around 25% always. Now the population grows, the economy grows, the government grows with it. So while change has been biased towards those industries, and for good reasons, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's due to Keynesian type policy. There's great momentum in the economy. We get about 200,000 new jobs every year. Within the workforce, about 1 million people change their job every year. The chart that was up before that showed the gains and the losses actually concealed a lot of gains and losses, because within each of those gains, each of those gaining industries, there are people moving jobs all the time. So there is a lot of momentum in the economy, and sometimes, you know, the loss of an industry or so forth sounds really bad, 300 jobs, 1,000 jobs and so forth, but in the context of ongoing growth of 200,000 jobs a year, those types of impacts, whilst profound, particularly if in small regions, do get absorbed. And in fact, our unemployment rate has crept up a little in the last 3 or 4 years, but only a little. Only a little, especially when you compare how much it ballooned in the 1980s.
Or if you compare us to Italy or Greece or Spain.
Exactly.
Marcus.
Look, I don't do optimism and pessimism. I'm not sort of graded on a curve. What I would observe is that change is inevitable. Well, it's the one thing you can't make go away. Like we are in a dynamic of rapid change. I think the question becomes, how do you accentuate the positives in that and minimise the negative effects of that? And I think we do need to talk about the distribution of resources in our society. We do need to talk about the people that get left behind. But equally, we do need to be aware of the opportunities that are being created and make sure that we embrace and adapt to them. And I think the challenge is really, how do we capitalise on these great possibilities that are taking place at the moment without being oblivious to the consequences of that.
Okay, Sherri.
Every year I speak to literally hundreds of teenagers and young adults who are homeless and struggling and really have hit rock bottom. And one of the things I ask them is, where will you be in 5 years? And almost without exception, they say, I'll have a beautiful home, I'll have a car, and most often it's one of those hotted up ones. I'll have a gorgeous partner, and I'll have a job. And I'll have a job. And they want it, and they are like your kids and mine. That's what they want. They're no different. And I believe that when people are given the opportunity to do good and to do the right thing, whether they be individuals or people who are organised together as a corporation or a government, people will choose to do good. And I think the challenge for me at Melbourne City Mission is to find the mechanisms by which people can do good and make a difference to the lives of these kids who want the same thing that we all want for our kids.
And finally, please join me in thanking our 4 panellists, Sherri, Marcus, Janine and Bernard.